Good evening, everybody. My name's Jeremy Walker, Headmaster of St. Peter's, and on behalf of all of us, a very warm welcome to you this evening. Also to Rajini Vaidyanathan, who's going to moderate this evening and introduce William Dalrymple. We massively enjoy our partnership with the University of York. Very glad that we could be helping out by hosting this evening. As you'll probably know, St. Peter's itself has a long history dating back to 627 AD. That is absolutely put in the shade by the sweep of William's recent book, The Golden Road. We're clearly in for a wonderful evening, so please join me in welcoming to the stage Rajini Vaidyanathan and William Dalrymple.
Good evening. Thanks for coming. It's a full house, William. It's quite exciting.
I last came here in a pair of shorts and rugby boots to lose to St. Peter's at rugby in about 1982 or something.
We're having a nostalgia moment earlier. So we're going to do a proper introduction for William in a second. But first of all, welcome to the 2025 edition of the York Festival of Ideas. Now, this year's programme has a theme of making waves. It's bringing together a range of world-class speakers, and William as well, exhibitions, performances, and a host of stimulating and interactive experiences for people of all ages. And the thing that's really special about this festival is the ethos of it, because to make it accessible and available to everyone, it's mostly free, the events here, and it's one of the biggest free festivals in the UK, but I should plug William's festival, the Jaipur Literature Festival, which is also a free festival, isn't it?
It is.
And if any of you ever feel like going to India, I don't work for the festival, I should just say.
She is on a retainer, though.
But I have to say, it is one of the greatest experiences you could ever do, is go to Jaipur. It's one of the best literature festivals in the world, as well as this one, obviously. So the plug is out of the way for that as well.
It's also in mid-January when York is at its most miserable. So another added reason for booking your ticket.
And as wonderful as this hall is, some of the talks in Jaipur are in Mughal palaces and places like that, which are all in keeping with William's writing. So, very briefly, let me introduce myself to you all. My name is Rajini Vaidyanathan. I am a news presenter and correspondent with BBC News. And being here is actually really special for me because this is a bit of a homecoming for me, because 25 years ago, next month, I graduated from the University of York.
She went up at the age of 10.
And if you all know your maths, then yes, I am older than I look. So it's been really nice to come here and walk around a city that evokes so many special memories for me. Now,
Particularly the nightclubs, you said.
I used to moan that there were only 3 nightclubs in York back in the day. One of them called Ziggy's, if any of you in the room remember that awful place. Anyway, we digress. But a couple of years after I graduated from university, a few years ago, I was given a book by a friend. It was called City of Gins, and it was written by a certain William Dalrymple.
And it wasn't about sort of tonics or...
No, it wasn't, definitely not. And I remember reading that book and being fascinated with India, a place that my mother and father were both born in, and my mum in particular was born in Delhi. Little did I think that maybe, 10 or 15 years later, I've lost count, I'd be living in Delhi.
And I just left college too.
Yeah, exactly. It's only last week William played rugby here.
Yeah, exactly.
That I would be in Delhi as the BBC South Asia correspondent. Not only would I be doing a dream job, but I'd also be friends with the man who wrote that book. So it really does feel like everything has come full circle, and it's a pleasure to be here. So let's introduce the author of that book and many other books, Mr. William Dalrymple. Now, as well as writing books like City of Gins, he's written The Last Mughal, White Mughals, what's the one about Afghanistan? Return of the King. Yeah. Read them, I just can't remember the names. Yeah. And more recently, the tome about the East India Company, Anarchy. And it was in 2020 that William and I did a talk about anarchy for the York Festival of Ideas, but it was a virtual conversation because, of course, it was in a time of COVID. So it's quite special that we're actually in the room this time.
Made it here this time.
I remember I was locked in a room in Delhi with a nice plant behind me because we were all doing things on Zoom. And I don't, where were you back then in 2020?
I would have been in Delhi too, I think, actually.
There you go. So socially distanced across a city that obviously bore the brunt of COVID. Anyway, the shape of this evening is going to be quite simple. If you've been to any of William's book talks before, he does a wonderful presentation, especially with a BBC Weather style clicker and everything. And then we will open it up to questions. So while William talks, you'll be able to have a think about what you would like to ask him, and we will try and get through as many questions. So we're going to be talking about this. This is William's latest book. It's not as fat as Anarchy.
It's thinner.
It's thinner.
And 100 pages of that are footnotes.
Well, there you go. It's wonderful.
It's thinner than it looks.
It's a wonderful book, and it's called The Golden Road, How Ancient India Transformed the World. And when the book came out, actually, and I interviewed William on TV, we were joking, if any of you watch Goodness Gracious Me, there's the character in the background who said that everything's Indian, Indian. Superman, Indian. That's basically William.
Leonardo da Vinci?
Exactly. So on that note, without further ado...
We actually got Sanjeev Bhaskar at the launch. He came along, yeah.
I couldn't, because I was working.
You were working.
In any case, you can listen to us witcher on in a bit, but without further ado, William Dalrymple and The Golden Road.
Well, it's very nice to be back in York without rugby boots on, I have to say. And very nostalgic to find, like you remembering the nightclubs. My memory is Red Rhino Records in Gillygate was my hangout, where I bought my first copy of Van Morrison's Moondoves and early Queen records before that, in my 16s. Anyway. So India is one of those parts of the world that very early came up with its own profound answers to the big questions that humanity has always asked of itself. Why are we here? How do you live a moral life? What is the nature of this earth we inhabit? What is the size of this earth we inhabit? What is the relationship of the earth to the planets, to the moon, to the stars, to the heavens? We are familiar with similar answers produced from ancient Greece, for example, and to a certain extent, I think also China, because of the idea of the Silk Road, which has become such a enormous sort of feature in the cultural life of our understanding of East and West, with books, documentaries, Netflix series about Marco Polo and so on. We're now, I think, very familiar with the whole idea of the passage of trade East and West. But somehow, despite the fact of the Raj, maybe partly because of the fact of the Raj, and the fact that it was obviously not in Britain's interest to stress India as a center of civilization. Instead, we were trying to spin the idea that we were bringing civilization to India. People in this country are much, much less familiar with the thinkers and with the ideas and the innovations of India than they are certainly of Greece and also of China. To give an example of mathematics, I suspect everyone in this room probably knew about Archimedes shouting Eureka in his bath by the age of 6. You'd have probably known about Pythagoras and his theorem by the age of 10 or 11. You'd had to have known about it for your 11 plus or whatever. But no one in this country, other than the occasional South Asian brought up with proud parents, has ever heard of the equivalent Indian figures, such as Aryabhatta. Aryabhatta, for example, is the character who in 300 AD exactly calculated the circumference of the Earth, exactly calculated the distance of the Earth to the Moon, and who realized that we lived in a heliocentric universe revolving around the sun 1,000 years before Galileo. But he's a name that's almost completely unknown in this country. Equally unknown is his successor, Brahmagupta, who defined zero. There'd been vague notions of zero as a placeholder or as a number between positive and negative numbers, as a space between positive and negative numbers. But Brahmagupta realized that zero was a number with its own properties and defined them, so allowing for fancy tricks like place value, tens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, so allowing for algorithms and algebra, and so allowing for the Indian number system of 9 numerals, 9 Indian numerals and 0, which miraculously allowed you to write any number up to infinity with just those 9 symbols and 0, something that we take completely for granted today because it is our number system. We call that number system Arabic numbers because we got them from the Arabs, but the Arabs got them from the Indians. And this, which should be absolutely basic knowledge, that the numbers that we use every day, whenever you open your phone, whenever you turn on a computer, whenever you use your burglar alarm when you come into your house, that these were invented in India. And it is somehow, it's fallen through the curriculum. Almost no one in this, not just Britain, but in Western Europe or America, knows that India was the home to these important and absolutely central innovations in human history. The number system is the nearest thing the human race has today to a universal language. We'd all be writing MXCCXVM if it wasn't for the Indians. And yet somehow, maybe partly because of colonialism and the way that the British downgraded Indian learning in the 19th century, Macaulay famously writing that a single shelf of a good English library is worth the entire native literature of India and Arabia. Now, we laugh at those sort of attitudes today, but they linger in our education system. And the fact that we don't know, have never heard of Aryabhata and Brahmagupta is indicative of a whole world which the West is completely ignorant about. And it was to fulfill this gap that I wrote The Golden Road. China is an interesting question because there's been a lot lately on the Silk Roads. Partly because it's just such a very glamorous and sexy idea that there is a road connecting the thin waste of Asia, moving from the Mediterranean to the South China Sea, from these ancient ports like Alexandria, Tyre, Gaza, Antioch, and Palmyra, through to Chang'an and Luoyang in China. And we all love that stuff of, Bactrian camels crossing the Himalayas and the Pamirs and saddlebags swinging as they go down the sand dunes of the Gobi Desert and all that. It's an idea that works at an academic level. It's an idea that works at a popular level with the Marco Polo Netflix series. It's an idea that works in geopolitics. And the Chinese have successfully built the whole Belt and Road project on the back of this idea of the Silk Road. And my first book was following that route that Marco Polo took along that dotted line from Jerusalem to Xanadu, Shangtu, Kublai Khan's pleasure dome. And at that time, I assumed that the Silk Road was an ancient phrase, that it was something that Marco Polo talked about, and you would find in classical sources. It was only more recently that I discovered that, in fact, that phrase was invented by a German geographer in 1877. That geographer was Baron von Richthofen, the grandfather of the Red Baron, who the boys in the audience may have learned about in sort of top trumps in their prep schools and so on. The man who shot down more British Sopwith camels than anyone else. But the grandfather came up with this idea, the Seidenstrassen, of a road linking the two ends of Asia. Or in his case, actually, he thought of it as a railway line between Berlin and Peking in the 1870s. That phrase, the Silk Road, only entered the English language in 1936 with the publication of a book by an explorer called Sven Hedin. And it was only in the 1980s, when I was last playing rugby here, that idea began to find a popular audience in the West. It began with a museum show at the Met Museum in New York, and then the National Gallery of Art in Washington. There were similar shows in Britain and Europe, and it became a thing. By the 1990s, any city you went to between Istanbul, Tashkent, and beyond would have Silk Road carpet shops, Silk Road restaurants, Silk Road bars, Silk Road hotels. And my pitch in this book is that while the Silk Road was certainly an important thing after the Mongol invasions, when the Mongols and Genghis Khan punched a hole through the middle of Asia, so connecting Mediterranean and South China Sea, allowing Marco Polo in 1271 to make that extraordinary journey in just 2 years, that before that, it was not a thing. And that these maps, which by including Alexandria and Antioch and Palmyra, project it backwards into classical antiquity, are, in fact, terribly mistaken. Because there is no evidence at all that there was any awareness in Rome of the existence of China, or any awareness of the existence of China in Rome. That both sides were completely ignorant of each other. We do not know of a single diplomatic mission or a single trader who passed from Rome to China or from China to Rome until the Middle Ages. There certainly took place, if you like, capillary trade, whereby an expensive item might pass from hand to hand and over the period of 40 or 50 years, make it from one end of the route to the other. But there was no motorway in the way that this is projected on that map, allowing easy access in two directions. However, although we know of not one single ship that ever passed between Rome and China, we know that whole fleets of 250 vessels a year passed every year from Roman Egypt to India along the Maritime route. And Strabo talks about going to the Red Sea port of Myos Hormuz and seeing nearly 300 vessels waiting for the winds to change so that they could sail to Kerala and Gujarat. Pliny, a conservative Roman naval commander, talks about how India is the drain of all the precious metals of the world. That so severe is the Roman taste for, so extreme is the Roman taste for Indian luxuries, that the gold accumulated by the Roman Empire was draining every year into Indian pockets. And Pliny is very disapproving of this. And as a rather austere North Italian naval commander, he talks with great, he sounds rather like a sort of, Spectator editorial or something. He would definitely have been, I think, a possible supporter of Nigel Farage, I think, if he would be inviting. And he talks about how these urban elites in Rome wear sort of porno wear, by which he means silk, this see-through textile through which you can see a woman's body. He's appalled by this. And then he says those woke urban elites in Rome put this woke spice on their food these days, by which he means pepper. And he thinks that only the kind of very young and silly would waste their money on this foreign spice. So this map, which is such a gorgeous idea when you first look at it, actually is very misleading when you're talking about the classical period, because it highlights a route that didn't exist in the early classical period, and it ignores a very important hub of East-West trade, which was in direct contact with the Roman Empire, which is India. So I'm going to make the case in this map that India, not China, was the center of East-West contact, and that it was the sea, not the overland route, which was the means of contact. And the most simple proof of this is to map the discoveries of Roman coin hoards. Where Romans are trading, they leave their coins behind. And if you map Roman coin hoards, that's technically 30 coins or more found in a single place. You can draw up a map. And if the Silk Road was actually a thing at this period, you'd expect to see the hordes following that route, that there'll be a more or less horizontal line where you find these coins running across Central Asia from Anatolia and Persia right through to China. But in fact, the map looks nothing like that at all. Here it is. As you'd expect, most Roman coins were found in Rome, in Italy, in Spain, in Gaul, in southern Britain, around the Mediterranean, in Greece, in Anatolia. There's a little outpost of Roman coins north of the Black Sea. There's another little line coming down the Nile. There is not a single Roman coin hoard ever found in China. Not one. But look at India and Sri Lanka, riddled with Roman coins. In fact, more Roman coin hoards discovered in India and Sri Lanka than any other place outside the Roman Empire. So this is the proof, if you like, that the idea of the Silk Road, projecting it back into the classical period, is hugely exaggerated. It's an example of historical groupthink. And the reality of trade in the classical period was very different, and that Rome's principal trading partner was not China, but India. Now, behind that trade came an extraordinary flow of Indian ideas, and I'm going to divide this evening into three headings, if you like. One is the spread of Buddhism. Second is the spread of Hinduism and Sanskrit and associated ideas of Hindu kingship. And the third is Indian ideas of astronomy, mathematics, and astrology, all of which were bound into a single science at the time called Jyotisa in Sanskrit. And those three ideas transformed the world in ways that simply we are totally unaware of in this country, because it's not taught in our schools, it's completely off the curriculum, and we do not learn it at any point in our lives. So to start with Buddhism, to just put it very straightforwardly, the Buddha was a historical character. He lived in the mid-5th century BCE in the Gangetic Plains. Now, what's interesting about Buddhism is that it did not spread outside the Gangetic Plains for 200 years. If you think of the story of Christianity, within a few generations, within a couple of generations, St. Paul is writing his letters to Christian communities across Anatolia, in Rome, in Thessaloniki, and so on. By the early 2nd century, Christianity got as far as St. Albans in this country. But the Buddhist message seems to have been restricted to a very small part of what's now Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, and a little area of Nepal for its first centuries. And the man who changed that was the Emperor Ashoka, who's one of the most crucial figures in world history. Ashoka converted to Buddhism about 250 BCE and set up a series of pillars with these lion capitals all over India, proclaiming his new message of the Buddhist Dharma right across the breadth of what's now India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. And indeed, to celebrate that, since the time of Nehru and Indian independence, these three lions have been the symbol of the Indian state. They're on every banknote, they're on every passport. Now, he sends missionaries beyond India. He calls them Dharma ministers. And he sends them into the world which has been orphaned, if you like, by the death of Alexander the Great in Babylon. Alexander dies in Babylon, and his generals squabble over his conquest. So Ptolemies take Egypt, Antiochus takes Anatolia, and Seleucus takes Persia and Afghanistan. And we know from an Ashoka inscription in Kandahar in Afghanistan that these Dharma ministers went as far as Libya, as Cyrene. So they went way outside the boundaries of anywhere we associate with India, spreading this message of Buddhism. But they had their greatest effect in Sri Lanka and in beyond India, in Burma, and later in Southeast Asia. By 150 BCE, you begin to get these gorgeous rock-cut Buddhist monasteries in the hills as far south as Pune, level with Bombay, halfway down. This rock-cut cave art, this is a sculpture out of a rock face, retains the shapes of lost Indian forms of architecture in bamboo and in wood. You can see all this gorgeous imitation of wooden architectural forms which have completely disappeared from the archaeological record, including Indian apartments. You see this couple here looking out of their balcony, and sort of another set of couples up here. These are ancient Indian apartment buildings which no longer exist in the archaeological record because they were built in bamboo and wood. But we now know what they looked like thanks to these. And as Buddhism heads south, we get the first Buddhist art, the extraordinary Bodhisattva in Ajanta, Padmapani, named after the lotus on his chest, hovering between two worlds. The Bodhisattvas are beings that have not taken the leap towards enlightenment and left this world, but remain in this world to help beings achieve enlightenment. Like the saints in medieval, they were figures you could appeal to, like the saints in the medieval Christian world of the West. And this being is hovering in a gale of stillness. Meanwhile, the Buddhist message is spreading on southwards to Sri Lanka, where the son of Ashoka, Mahinda, converts the king of Sri Lanka to Buddhism. And the stupa, the burial, the mound of stones marking the burial place of the son of Ashoka, Mahinda, was recently discovered with an inscription of his name on it in Rajagala, in the jungles of central Sri Lanka, literally only 2 years ago. So Sri Lanka becomes a major center of the Buddhist missionary movement, and over the next 200 or 300 years, we see one of the great miracles of world history. Having been very slow to leave the Gangetic Plains, from the time of Ashoka onwards, these extraordinary missionary monks head up through Pakistan and Gandhara, Afghanistan into what's now Uzbekistan, Bactria, up through Lhasa, through China to Mongolia and beyond to Siberia, and again to Chang'an, through Korea and Japan, down through Burma, Laos, Siam, Cambodia, and on as far as the Philippines. All through the power of ideas. None of this none of these conversions take place with swords or conquest. It is a conquest of the spirit. It is a conversion of the mind. Unlike the spread of Christianity in some examples and the spread of Islam in other examples, it is never carried by victorious troops. It is entirely a missionary movement. And the missionaries are following Indian traders. And in a matter of 300 or 400 years, not only Buddhist ideas of how to avoid suffering, but also Indian ideas of geography, of science, of mathematics, of art, of aesthetics, of literature, and Indian languages like Prakrit and Sanskrit are spreading out over the whole of Asia. So that by the 2nd or 3rd century AD, countries which today amount to about half the world's population had all converted to Indic religions. It's one of the most important transformations in world history, but again, one that barely figures in any curriculum in the Western world. And it isn't that it's a temporary change, because when you go to Burma or to Korea or Japan or Mongolia or Thailand or Cambodia today, you still find Buddhists, still all following the way of the Buddha and still subscribing to Indian ideas. And this has remained even in countries which have subsequently converted to Islam, like Indonesia. The national carrier of Indonesia is Garuda, which is named after Lord Vishnu's mount. And so the memory of this Indian influence has spread out over this vast area. And so this is one of the most extraordinary examples of the spread of ideas without arms, an empire of the spirit. And it takes place from about 250 BCE till about the 12th century AD. Indian ideas are dominating great swathes of the world. And even as I'm writing this book, the amplitude of this Indosphere, as I call it, is expanding. I had already written the first draft when this turns up, which is a gorgeous head of the Buddha, found in a temple to the goddess Isis in ancient Egypt on the Red Sea coast. The head is, as you'd expect to find on a Gandharan Buddha from Pakistan or Afghanistan, but the material is Proconnesian marble from the Marmara Sea opposite Istanbul. What the archaeologists nicely call the tortellini curls of the Buddha are drilled with a drill that was only in use in Alexandria, so we know it was made in Alexandria, which must have been familiar enough with the idea and the aesthetics of Buddhism to make this perfect Buddha head in the 1st century AD. And then we have this odd syncretism where we have sun rays coming out from behind his head, as if he's a solar deity like Sol Invictus or Mithras, a deity who would have been worshipped in Yorkshire, under the Minster, in the Roman legionary fortress. So we have these interesting syncretisms going on. And by the 1st century AD, after the death of Cleopatra, remember from your literature classes at school, Cleopatra puts the asp to her breast and commits suicide. Octavius, later Augustus, takes over Egypt. And with that, India has effectively got a border with the Roman Empire. And it takes only 2 months to sail from ports such as Myos Hormuz, Mussel Harbour, or Berenike, where the Buddha was found, down the Gulf, round Aden, and to Kerala, or to Gujarat, or to the mouth of the Indus. And by the 1st century, you get this book, which has a complicated name, The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, but which is actually just the Lonely Planet, or the rough guide of its day. A guide written for Roman sailors. And what's interesting is that it knows every single port on the West Indian coast. And it knows what people want to buy. So in Barigaza, for example, in the Gujarat, the king has a taste for Roman castrati singing boys, and he advises any captain setting off for there to pack singing boys in his boat. As for China, all it says is that somewhere over there is a city called Thebes, where a very great inland city called Thebes, from which silk is found. So there's some vague concept of silk, but it is difficult to get to, very far north and very difficult to get to. So you have the contrast between India, which you have infinite detail about the ports, and vague rumors about China. So completely the opposite of what this idea of the Silk Road would lead one to believe. And the thing that's facilitating this closeness of the Roman world with the Indian world is this landmass up here. It's Tibet. Because Tibet freezes over in winter and cold winds rake in, just when it's getting chilly in York. You get these gales blowing into Tibet. Then about now, you get the thaw, and Tibet begins to warm up, and warm winds blow out. So India, which is the most unpunctual place Rajini and I have ever lived, actually has incredibly punctual and well-behaved monsoons, which come with great regularity, and these winds blow out for 6 months of the year and in for 6 months of the year, which means that if you're an ancient Indian sailor, you've only got to put up your sail. And in 2 months, you're whisked off to Egypt or to the Malacca Straits. And then if you're going to Egypt, you can go and see the pyramids, go and sell your goods in Alexandria, go and see a show, all that kind of thing. And then you've got to be back 4 months later on the coast, and the winds reverse and blow you home again. And that is what powered this extraordinary trade, and which created the great Indian diaspora communities. That's why there have always been Gujaratis on the East African and in the Arabian world. It's why until 1947, there were huge communities of Tamils in Burma and Singapore. because they're blown that way by the winds, and they're reconnected with their motherlands every year as the winds reverse. It's one of the great gifts that India has. And one place we mustn't forget in all this is Ethiopia. Ethiopia is on the way. Adulis, Aksum, these great ports are part of this trading system. And you see on early Indian sculptures elegant courtiers from Aksum and the great Ethiopian courts coming in their gowns with long swords, being introduced by courtiers to an Indian king, while their page boys on their knees are bringing offering in asking for trading rights. There's a whole trading world that we've been completely forgotten about, which dominated the trade of early Rome and early India. And thanks to this document, the Mosiris Papyrus, we now have figures. We can actually calculate some data. Because the Mosiris Papyrus, which turned up about 20 years ago on the black market and is now in Vienna, is probably from the town of Oxyrhynchus, which has these extraordinary rubbish dumps where amazing documents, the Gospel of Thomas, the previously unknown gospel, turned up there. Early sayings of Jesus, lost lesbian erotica by Sappho, shopping lists, letters from lovers. Huge piles of this papyrus turned up completely intact in the Western Desert. And this is just a random shipping invoice of the sort that's made out in any great port every day of the year. And it tells about the contents of one particular container leaving Mosiris and Kerala, shipping to Alexandria in Egypt. What was being traded? Well, we actually know what was being traded from mosaics in Sicily. Now, this is a wonderful discovery recently in Sicily, and it shows it's presumably erected by a merchant who was engaged in the Indian trade. He's got a personification of India at the center of it, this very kind of fecund and busty woman based on an Indian yakshi. These are nature spirits that you get in Indian art. And they're meant to be images of fertility and fecundity incarnate. So much so that when she touches the tree behind her, a blossom emerges, erupts out of the earth. She immediately turns the tree into fruiting and blossoming. Now, the Roman artist didn't understand that idea, so he just has her clinging onto a tree here. Nothing much is happening. But it shows that this image is based on an Indian image, although it's in Sicily. Now, what is she holding? What is the personification of India holding? She's holding a tusk of an elephant. There's another one here. And ivory is the single most important export of India to Rome, followed by the thing that Pliny hates most, pepper, the woke spice. Here is pepper vines hanging from this tree. And what is she wearing? She's wearing Pliny's porno wear silk, where you can see her clothes, her naked form beneath her body, because Roman women, society women, only wore single wrap silk, so they were appearing semi-naked at posh parties. We know of one particular mistress of Nero called Lolina Paulina, who used to appear at Roman parties wearing this sort of silk, showing off everything, but also wearing Indian diamonds in her hair, Indian garnets in her belly button, Indian pearls on her shoes, and she carried the receipts to the parties to show people how much she'd spent on it. And this is exactly why Pliny's very disapproving of the Indian trade, because it's not for essential things that the Roman peasantry needed for fighting their world war or anything. It wasn't we didn't get steel or tin or bronze from India. You got luxuries, you got pepper, you got silk, totally unnecessary things that you could give up tomorrow. You also got circus animals. I don't know how many of you have seen Gladiator 2, but remember the rhino in that. Here we have tigers and elephants. And there's also this, which is malabathrum, which is used in perfumery. It's like a cinnamon-like smoky leaf, which gives a very musky scent. And nard. Can you remember in the Gospel, I think, of Matthew, where Jesus goes to the house of Martha and Mary, and they put nard on his feet? And the other apostles complained because it's very expensive and they should have sold it and given it to the poor. Now, it's expensive because it comes from the Himalayas. It's an antelope gland, and it's musk. and it's the base of very expensive perfumery. So it's rather like sort of giving Jesus caviar when he comes to dinner. It's the Roman equivalent of that. And so it's no wonder that people were disapproving that this should have been lavished on this ascetic. And these things, perfumery, ivory, pepper, and silks, are the items which are contained in this shipping invoice. Plus, we have the figures. And what we know from the figures, how much they cost, is that basically Rajani's Indian ancestors were ripping us all off here, particularly the South Indians, actually, clearly, that they were overcharging for their pepper. And that so expensive were these luxury exports that this one container, which contained 200 tons of ivory and about 60 massive jars of pepper, the whole thing, which is calculated in the shipping invoice, if it was sold, would have made the seller almost the richest man in Roman Egypt. He could have bought any estate in Roman Egypt with the profits that he made from this. And so he could have been the kind of Elon Musk of Alexandria, just with one successful shipment. God help us for Elon Musk, but yeah, at least he would be very rich. And what's also clear from this is that the Romans were putting a 30% tariff, while we're on Trump and Musk, on this. And economic historians are now calculating that maybe as much as a quarter of the Roman imperial budget came from the Red Sea customs take of these super expensive luxuries coming over the border, and 30% is leveled on them. So Hadrian's Wall, maybe your Roman headquarters under the Minster, the Appian Way, the Rhine frontier fortresses, a third of all this was being paid for by these luxuries coming into Rome from India. So there's a huge world that we haven't forgotten about, and there's the discoveries of Indian luxury goods are found all over digs in Pompeii and so on. But we also see the reverse, of course, because it was a two-way trade. So we see these nice Alexandrian glass beakers turning up where? Under the American Air Force Base in Bagram in Afghanistan. And here we have Russell Crowe in gladiator outfit, the Pharos Lighthouse, and a wine harvest. And this is all Roman art from Egypt, which is appearing in Afghanistan and in North India, leading to extraordinary artistic echoes. So this is a Coptic papyrus of Jesus and his disciples that seems to be uncannily like this wall painting slightly later of the Buddha and his disciples from Afghanistan. And the effect of Roman art is dramatic on Indian art. In early Indian art, the Buddha is never shown as a human being. He's a symbol. He's shown as the wheel of law. So here these monks are bowing to the Buddha in this symbolic form. Here he's shown as the stupa, which contains his cremated ashes, which two elephants are worshipping. Here he is a flaming pillar. But when the Romans begin to export their sculpture and their art to India, suddenly the Buddha appears in the 1st century AD wearing a toga looking like Apollo. And in the centuries to come, we get these very classical-looking faces on the Buddha, on the head of the Buddha, in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. And you've only got to compare a figure of Augustus from the Forum in Rome. Look at the drapery there, and compare it to a bodhisattva from Peshawar to see how close the artistic worlds are. We think of them as being completely separate worlds, but actually they are very, very close to each other. And this very Romanized image of the Buddha in human form heads on northwards through Afghanistan, through this wonderful site called Mezainak, which is being dug at the moment in Afghanistan, before the Chinese destroy this entire site. There are the Chinese mining barracks, because it's sitting on top of one of the largest copper deposits in the world. And that reminds us that we associate Buddhism in the West with otherworldliness. In Hollywood films, Buddhist monks as sort of shorthand for levitating sort of spiritual figures with amazing spiritual powers. But in the real world, Buddhist monks were supported by merchants, Merchants, if you like, greenwashed their sins by giving their profits to monasteries. And the monasteries willingly acted as bankers and as places of refuge for the traders. So as Buddhism spreads up the trade routes, the monasteries are banks lending to merchants, sheltering them, which is why you get often quite sort of sexy pictures in monasteries, because they're not just attracting the monks, they're trying to gather patrons and rich patrons to give donations. So Ajanta, you have these lovely pictures of girls in swings, which don't look very, it's meant to be the court that the Buddha was from. But you would have thought it's rather distracting if you're a celibate monk to have these gorgeous sensuous images. And the idea is actually that they're trying to attract patrons, trying to find people to pay for their monasteries. So along the trade routes through Bamiyan and Afghanistan on up into China, where suddenly we begin to see the Buddha looking like one of those lovely Romanized Buddhas, but with Chinese eyes. And Buddhism spreads from Western China through Gansu into Eastern China. And by the early 300s, we see imitations of Indian Buddhist art. Look at the drapery there with this gorgeous belly button and the pajama line and little fold of flesh. You see much cruder versions of that in central China by about 300 AD. And by about 500 AD, you're getting Indian images of flying celestials hovering over the domes of Buddhist monasteries. Some of the monks seem to be smoking something quite rich, judging by some of these images of monks levitating and with flames coming out of their feet, or blue elephants looking like something out of San Francisco in 1967. But by the 6th century, the Buddhist faith has reached the court and is competing with Confucianism and Taoism. And the big breakthrough is this man, Xuanzang. Xuanzang is a traveling monk who goes to India by foot. Against the law, he leaves China and travels through the Gobi Desert, through the Taklamakan, over the Pamirs and the Himalayas, and eventually gets to the site of the Buddha's enlightenment in Bodh Gaya. But the reason he's gone is not just for spiritual edification. He is a scholar, and he has a backpack full of scrolls. And his point is to go to the monastery of Nalanda, which is like the university, like the Library of Alexandria for India, and to gather the great works of Buddhist learning and bring them back to China. And Nalanda, which again is something we're not familiar with in the West, is the great ancient university of India. And the big surprise is the plan. Look at the plan. It looks exactly like one of our universities. It has a courtyard, a cloister walk, and then scholars' rooms over 2 stories. Exactly what you'd find in Trinity College, Cambridge, or Balliol, or any Oxford or Cambridge college. And that plan seems to have passed from the Buddhist monasteries of India through the madrasas of Islam to the quads and courts of Oxbridge by the 11th century. Because where do universities first appear in the West? In Salerno, in Bologna, in Paris, on the edge of Islamic Spain, and then Oxford and Cambridge by the 12th century. So you can make a very good case that the form of Western universities is based on the Buddhist universities of India. But what Xuanzang is most impressed with is the great library of Nalanda, 9 stories high. He writes about how you could study the Vedas, logic, grammar, philosophy, medicine, metaphysics, divination, mathematics, Sanskrit, astronomy, literature, and magic. It was 9 stories high and contained 3 divisions. The priests, in number of several thousands, from morning until night, engage in discussions. The old and the young mutually help each other. The students studied diligently without wasting a moment, I'm sure like St. Peter's. And the atmosphere in the monastery was solemn and dignified, I'm sure also St. Peter's, as exam time comes close by. And we know from this foundation tablet that kings as far away as modern Indonesia were leaving large bequests for expatriate colleges. So this is the king of Indonesia leaving something like 600 villages in order to provide funds for monks from Southeast Asia. And we know that they came from Nepal, Tibet, Sri Lanka, Sumatra, and even Korea. So Xuanzang crosses over the Himalayas, comes to Nalanda, spends 20 years copying out manuscripts of Buddhist learning and Buddhist philosophy and particularly the Yogacara texts, which are these very important Mahayana Buddhist texts. And then he brings them back to India. And when he comes back to India, the emperor, who's a guy called Xuanzang, builds him a copy of the Nalanda Library in Chang'an, where he can place his manuscripts. Now, unbeknown to Xuanzang, the Emperor Taizong has just taken on a 15-year-old concubine. Her name is Wu Zetian. And she's a very important figure because she's a Buddhist and she's ambitious. And she's a bit of a hottie. She starts off, you wouldn't know it from this picture, but she manages somehow to jump from the bed of Taizong into the bed of his son, Gaizong, and becomes the consort, then the empress of, this is what she looks like in the soap operas. You get a bit more picture of what's going on here. So she becomes, first of all, the wife of the son, Gaizong, then the empress, and then when he has a stroke, she becomes China's first and only woman emperor. How does she do this? She has a think tank, rather like the kind of dodgy Tory think tanks that brought about Brexit, Smith Square and Tufton Street and all this sort of stuff. She has something called the Scholars of the Northern Gate, who bring about this revolution that turns China into a Buddhist state. The Confucians and the Taoists are kicked out of court for a period, and the Buddhists take over. And in return, the Buddhist monks come up with all sorts of prophecies that she's actually not a human being, she's the reincarnation of the Bodhisattva Maitreya, and a whole lot of kind of fake prophecy is produced to keep her in power. But leaving that aside, this is the high watermark of Indian influence in China. The Silk Road theory, with its Sinocentricity, leads us to believe that China is the center of culture and trade. But if you're looking at this period, India is the dominant partner, and it is Indian religions and Indian languages and Indian ideas which are traveling from India to China and changing everything in China. Because Buddhism is an Indian faith, and today, the most Buddhists in the world are in China. So it's an extraordinary reversal of what we've been brought up to think of. India is the center, and China is, in this period, the periphery. Now, at the same time that this is going on, the same sort of thing is happening in Southeast Asia, but with Hinduism. This is an image of Lord Vishnu from Southeast Asia. Now, how does Hinduism spread to Southeast Asia? Well, when Rome falls in the 4th century, and the legionary fortress here in Rome is abandoned, 410, the legions march away, never to return. The 9th is already lost somewhere up Bransby Bank or something. So suddenly, no more Roman ships bearing gold are arriving on the west coast of India. And so the Indian merchants swivel, pivot eastwards, looking to the lands they come to call Savarna Bhumi, the lands of gold. And they look for the places where you can get gold in Southeast Asia to replace the gold that was pouring into their pockets from Rome. Bujang in Malaysia, Palembang in Sumatra, Keling in Java, Kutai in Borneo, Champa on the Mekong Delta, and ultimately selling it in Guangzhou, modern Canton, in the anglicized version. So the trading guilds, which had dominated the trade of India, pivot eastwards, and with that, you get boatloads of Indian merchants, monks, Brahmins, holy men, sculptors, writers, poets, heading eastwards to Savarna Bhumi in amazing wooden boats like this, with these very complex sails that captured the monsoon winds. By the 5th century, you're getting the Buddhist Wheel of Law turning up in Thailand. You have images of the Buddha, Shiva lingams and yonis, and images of Lord Shiva turning up in Malaysia. In the Mekong Delta, you have these wonderful canals where you can, crossing the Mekong Delta, where you can leave your boats for the winter, like you can in the Venice Lagoon at the other end of the trading routes. And if you take a boat down one of these little canals, it's on the hills at the edge of the Mekong Delta that you find the first Hindu temples. And here they are. Ashram Maharose is the oldest Hindu temple in Southeast Asia. In it are these extraordinary images of Lord Vishnu. But quite interesting, from the beginning, they're not identical to images in India. He has, for example, a Khmer sampot. That's this little waist wrap that's the national dress of Cambodia. And as Hinduism develops in Cambodia and Thailand and Burma and Vietnam, it takes on its own forms. In this part of the world, you have women Brahmins performing in temples. You don't have the caste system. Everyone's eating beer and drinking beer and eating pork. So it's a radically different sort of Hinduism to the one we're used to in India. Here, for example, this is Jayavarman II, the founder of the Angkor dynasty. He's showing himself as Lord Vishnu. He's got a discus, he's got a conch, which would be regarded as blasphemy in India. So this is what's going on. Some old chieftain on a port on the edge of an estuary has more and more Indian Brahmins arriving with their Brahmins' cords and their dreadlocks like sadhus in India today. And they're converting this king, effectively baptizing him with the Abhisheka ceremony. That's like a form of baptism or ceremonial anointing. And the Abhisheka ceremony converts this man who had been called Kodunga into a man now with a Sanskrit name, Suryavarman, protected by the sun. And he begins to adopt the Indian writing system, Southern Brahmi or Pallava Grantha, which is the basis of every single Southeast Asian script. Mon, Khmer, Thai, Pew, these all derive from South Indian Pallava script. In the North Indian scripts, if you know them, if you think of Hindi, have the washing line, a straight line, and the letters fall off them. The South Indian scripts are circular because they're designed to be written on palm leaf. If you draw a straight line like you do with the North Indian script and then put your letters on it, you rip the palm. So they develop a special South Indian form of the script, which is the basis for every Southeast Asian language, which is why if you are Tamil, you can recognize cousins of your letter forms in Thailand or in Malaysia or in Burma. And as Hinduism becomes more widespread, the landscape has changed. You find the holy city of Ayodhya, the great holy city of Lord Ram, reappears in a new version in Thailand. Kurukshetra, the holy city of the Mahabharata, the holy battle of the Mahabharata, appears in Laos. And the holy rivers of Southeast Asia have lingams and yonis carved into the symbols of Lord Shiva, carved into their banks. And the central river system of Southeast Asia is renamed after Ma Ganga, or in the Southeast Asian Khmer pronunciation, Mekong, the Mekong. So the whole of Southeast Asia is Indianized over this period of time. You begin to see temples, very like the Shore Temple in south of Madras, reappearing in Java. You see images of the Mahabharata. And by the 9th century, the temples of Southeast Asia are actually bigger than the ones being built in India, because in Southeast Asia, you have two big mega states. Srivijaya, which is the whole of Indonesia, and then the great Khmer Empire, which occupies all the mainland of Southeast Asia. And the largest Buddhist monument in the world is built in Java, in Borobudur, this wonderful step pyramid with a mandala form. And in Khmer heartland, in Angkor, the largest Hindu temple in the world is built at Angkor Wat. It's an extraordinary fact that there is no temple in India, even today, which is even half the size of Angkor Wat. This is today a Buddhist temple, but it was originally a Hindu temple to Lord Vishnu. And it's absolutely vast. The outer moat is encloses an area 4 times the size of the Vatican City. But the forms of the architecture have now developed in such a way that they're no longer clearly based on Indian models. When Tagore visits Angkor Wat in 1920, he says, "Everywhere I could see India, yet I could not recognize her." So what you've had is that this Southeast Asian Hinduism, which is developing on its own, in its own trajectory, takes on architecture and ideas and philosophies that are distinct from the Indian one. And today, when you go to Bali, for example, the last great outpost of Hinduism in Southeast Asia, you see a very different aniconic version of Hinduism. Although Indian missionaries are beginning now to sort of make it the same as the version in India. Anyway, just to finish off, numbers, science, and mathematics. Now, you can read that. It's the number 270. It's from a 10th century inscription in Gwalior, dating back 3 centuries before these numbers appear in the West. So to understand what's going on here, we have to go back to the great Gupta period of the 3rd, 4th century AD, when India is at its most scholarly and innovative. And here at Udaygiri, you have an incredible observatory that's like the Greenwich Mean Time, the Greenwich or the NASA of its day. There are sight lines, there are astronomy platforms. It's directly on the Tropic of Cancer, and it's being used to calculate, to make astronomical calculations, to decide the calendar, to define festivals, and so on. And from the centers of the Gupta Empire and through the mathematics of Aryabhatta, who we talked about at the beginning, you suddenly end up getting this massive innovation in human understanding. And that is the world's very first zero. Within a century, it's taken its modern form of the polo mint, representing sunya, the void, in Indian philosophy. Now, how does that innovation in India end up being the numbers we all use here in York today? So this is something that everyone should learn in their mathematics, and no one is taught. Our numbers begin in the 1st century AD with Brahmi. By the 9th century, with the inscription we just looked at, you get the 2, the 7, and the 0. And then it splits in 3 branches: Devanagari, staying on in India; East Arabic, which is the numbers forms used today in Cairo or in Baghdad or Iran; and then the West Arabic numbers developed in Morocco and Islamic Spain, and those numbers become, by the 16th century, our numbers that we immediately recognize. That's how we get our numbers. Yet not one person in this room, I guess, has ever been taught that. It's an extraordinary omission from our curriculum in the 21st century. One of the most basic things of our civilization, one of the most basic universal things of our language, developed in India, none of us know it. How does it get to the Middle East from India? Well, a fascinating story, and then probably through a Disney character. Although none of you may have heard of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta, you will have heard of Aladdin, the Disney film, or probably watched it with your children or grandchildren when they get up too early in the morning. And this is Jafar, who is the villain of the piece. He's a real character. He's in the Arabian Nights. And in the real world, Jafar is the vizier of the Abbasid caliphs of Baghdad. And he is from a family of Buddhist abbots in Afghanistan who convert to Islam and bring into the Islamic system the old Sanskrit numbers and mathematical learning. In fact, these guys get their job as viziers because they're such good accountants. They are initially put in charge of the army accounts, and they do such a spectacular job that, rather like the Indian CEOs now taking over Microsoft and Starbucks and Boeing and every other major business in the United States, these guys, the Barma kids, become the viziers in Baghdad. and they found the city of Baghdad, and the first thing they do is to bring Aryabhata and Brahmagupta's texts from Sind to Baghdad. They're translated by this guy called Al-Khwarizmi, a generation later. And Al-Khwarizmi writes this book called the Compendious Book of Calculating by Completion and Balancing According to Hindu Calculation. Now that's a bit of a mouthful, so people know it by a nickname, Al-Jabr. And Al-Khwarizmi, his name becomes the basis for our word, anyone? Algorithm. So algebra and algorithms come from this meeting of Indian learning transferring into the Islamic world. Now, how does it come to Europe? Next bit of the story. So along with chess, another Indian idea that travels through Persia and the Middle East, when you say checkmate, you don't realize it, but you're speaking Farsi. Shah Mat, the king is dead. We still use the Persian names for these Indian game pieces. And these ideas travel westwards. So Al-Khwarizmi, well, the books of Aryabhata and Brahmagupta come from Sind. They're brought to Baghdad. Al-Khwarizmi comes from Khwarazm. Al-Khwarizmi just means the man from Khwarazm. He comes down to Baghdad, he translates these Indian texts, and their translation passes through Palestine, Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and Spain. And by 950, Christian monks in Barcelona are using it for the first time, the Indian number system, which they call the Hindu number system, or the modus Indorum, the Indian method. But, amazingly, for 200 years more, Northern Europe continues to use the Latin system. So they're still doing MCV CCX times CCMV CCX, or try doing that at home, or try even giving your phone number in Latin numerals, and you realize what a business it is. And what happens is, as late as 1120, the city-state of Pisa, as in the Leaning Tower, found a trading colony in Algeria. And the man who founds that colony brings his son, and the son learns Arabic and learns Al-Khwarizmi's mathematics. And when he goes home, he finds all his mates still doing MCCXVCCX, and so he writes a book. And that guy, helpfully for us all, is Fibonacci. So Fibonacci is the person that brings the Indian number system from the Arab world through to Italy. And he writes a book called the Liber Abaci, which explains the Indian number system to Europeans. And this manuscript reaches the ears of King Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor of Sicily and the Holy Roman Empire. And he comes up to Pisa, falls in love with Fibonacci's brain, and invites him to this wonderful spot, which is called Castel del Monte, which is his perfectly geometrical palace. And there Fibonacci's introduced to a Scotsman, a very good northern element of this story. And that is Michael Scott from Melrose, not a million miles from York, just over the border. And Michael Scott has learnt Arabic and has understood all this Indian number system in its Arabic form. And he tells Fibonacci, it's all brilliant, but it's a wee bit theoretical, he says. You need to be a wee bit more pragmatic and a wee bit more straightforward. So he says, you've got to have usury, you've got to have currency conversion, weights and measures. And it is the second edition of the Liber Abaci, which becomes the main mathematical treatise in the period leading up to the Renaissance. It's the text which leads to the banking revolution that starts the Medici. A copy of it reaches the studio of Piero della Francesca, who writes 3 mathematical treatises based on it. This is all, the famous flagellation is a text about perspective, which is based on Fibonacci's mathematics. Then when Piero della Francesco dies, his friend Fra Luca Caroli takes the 3 mathematical texts to Milan, where he shows it to his flatmate, and the flatmate is drawing a fresco of the Last Supper in Milan. You've got it. It's Leonardo da Vinci. So in 5 steps, you've gone from Leonardo to Piero, Piero to Fibonacci, Fibonacci to Al-Khwarizmi, Al-Khwarizmi to Brahmagupta, Brahmagupta to Aryabhatta. The fount of Indian learning to the greatest Renaissance mind. And that's how these ideas come to Europe. Sadly, what happens next is that it comes to England and we get the East India Company, but we'll do that another day. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was fantastic, wasn't it? It was absolutely brilliant. I've been told that we've run over a bit, so...
I thought we might have done.
But I think it was worth it. So unfortunately, I don't know if we'll have time for audience questions, but it was
Take
brilliant.
a couple. We can take a couple.
I will get everyone out of here by 9. Is that allowed? A bit more? Indian time? It's always flexible.
Always flexible. Indian's flexible time.
While they confer...
Oh, I'm falling off. I could do a Stephen Fry. Thank you.
You're big on TikTok if you do that. One of my biggest takeaways while they're conferring was the fact that South Indians did a lot of this. And
Very important South Indians, yeah.
Built all the temples. Well, I'll ask one question while we confer. One of the things that struck me, and I've seen William's presentations before, and it applies to other books, is just how, as a historian, you draw a lot of what you find from old paintings, old sculptures. What else did I write down? Mosaics, you mentioned. Something else I wrote down too. But it's really fascinating because I just wanted to get more of an insight about how you go about doing that. You know, do you take pictures? Do you write notes? You're like, oh, that's that character that I...
Yeah, I was always a keen art historian, trained by the monks at Ampleforth, all this. And my wonderful art history teacher, Ampleforth, just died this year, Father Edward Corbould. I don't know if any of you in the audience ever came across him. And yeah, no, I was always taught to do history very visually. And it's just how I operate now.
It's very engaging because you write about that as well. You write about trips and you've talked about
Thank you for
them.
saving me for my tumbling.
I put it there on purpose. We go viral. But yeah, it's interesting because you write about that in the book and some of the visits you've been to Afghanistan, places like that. What's the most exciting discovery you've made? Because you are an art historian, as you say. You've seen a lot of this. You've been to a lot of the temples. But for example, with this book, what was the one thing that you saw that solved a puzzle?
Well, I like all of us, I was not taught any of this at school or university. And so much of it was a discovery for me. I mean, I don't think anything in this book is completely new. This is trying to bring together ideas that are scattered in different silos. So there's the whole world of Buddhist studies, the whole world of Sanskrit studies, the whole world of mathematical studies. All this book is doing is bringing stuff together under one roof. But I think that all that mathematical stuff was the thing that blew my mind. Also, the whole story of Wu Zetian, which I barely touched on, but she is quite a number.
She's quite something.
She's quite a girl.
We all laughed when we saw that picture. Am I allowed to ask a couple of audience? 2. Let's start and then we'll get started.
5 minutes.
Want to put hands up?
Can we have the lights up?
Show of hands, and we'll try. The quicker we get the questions in, the more we'll get to you all. 5 minutes.
5 minutes,
Okay,
2 questions.
Minutes. So it's got to be a 15-second question and a 15-second answer, and then everyone will get one.
This lady's standing up with a microphone. Go for it.
Marco Polo, how far do you think he actually travelled?
I think he went all the way. I don't think there's any doubt that he did do that. What's the confusing element of the story, and the reason there is question marks asked, is that he is giving a description of the world. So not everywhere that he describes did he go. But we have a pretty clear idea of what the main road to Mongolia was if you were going over. And so I think what's in dispute is his sort of dog's legs. For example, when he describes Baghdad, it's not on the road, it's clearly somewhere he didn't visit.
Next question.
Next question.
Got to be efficient.
You should become a newsreader.
I wondered if you'd read Walter Scheidele's recent book on what is ancient history and what you thought of his proposal that we abolish classics and instead teach global, ancient or foundational history.
Which book?
What is ancient history?
I haven't read it. No, I will go and look it up.
Okay, he hasn't read it. Next question.
I might have radically changed my book if I had.
I think someone's going...
There's someone with a hand up. Right, sorry, we're working the poor lady with the microphone.
Right, I'll be very quick. Thank you very much for the lecture. It's one of the best I've ever been to. I've been all around India and seen all the camels, and it really hits you. The sounds, the smells, you know, the culture, you know. As soon as you get out of the plane, to bus, automobile, you know, it's a fascinating country. And yeah, I'd love to live there. And I've also been to Samarkand as well, where they wear the burqas, and men wear the burqas. They're completely covered, the people. They're very strict Muslim there. And I've been to Egypt as well. You know, I could take hours from this.
So could I just ask what your question is, please, if I may?
No, it's a very delightful statement.
Well, thank you very much. We appreciate it. Okay. 15 seconds. Why wasn't this book written sooner? If you knew all this about how India was behind so many great inventions, what took you so long?
Well, me. The weird thing is that no one else has written this. And it's particularly weird given the Sanjeev Bhaskar urge of so many Indians to... What's happened, though, is it's become, because of the whole... what Sanjeev Bhaskar is satirizing with his India uncle is the fact that Indians know that they come from a great culture. But they also know that it's not taught anywhere in the world, that no one knows about it. And that has led to a frustration, and in the absence of clear history giving this to them, there's a whole load of nonsense out there about Indians inventing nuclear weapons in the Mahabharata and helicopters in the Ramayana.
Harry Potter being Harry Potter.
Harry Potter.
Say.
And what's been lovely with this book is the fact that Indians have taken it to their heart. It was #1 for over 6 months in the Indian bestseller list, and it has. I mean, there's scholars of the different disciplines know all this stuff, but it's never filtered down into popular consciousness before. And I hope now it will, and Indians will become proud of this extraordinary past.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you so much,
Thank
William.
you. Thank you so much. Thank you. And Rajani.